Welcome to the Silent Empires, where power speaks in whispers and every story lingers in the shadows. No interruptions here, just smooth, uninterrupted storytelling for those who understand the quiet behind it all. If this story drew you in, if you felt its presence even for a moment, take a second to like the video. And in the comments, share something simple but meaningful. Where are you watching from? And what time is it for you right now? I want to see how far this empire stretches, and who's here with me in this very moment. The federal courtroom in Brooklyn was not built for drama, yet on winter mornings in the early 1990s it felt like a stage. The pews were packed with reporters, off-duty detectives, and quiet men in dark coats who never gave their names. At the front of the room, under the Great Seal of the United States, a heavy-set man adjusted the microphone and leaned toward the jury. Prosecutors introduced him as Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta, a former captain in the Colombo crime family. For years, his name had traveled in whispers through social clubs and back rooms. Now, it echoed in open court, spelled out in black type on government exhibits. He spoke calmly about secret meetings, coded phone calls, and a war inside one of New York's most entrenched crime families. On one side of the room sat relatives of men he had once called friends. On the other, agents who had spent their careers trying to crack organizations like his. Between them stood this single figure, a man whose life had moved from the shadows of Brooklyn's side streets to the bright, relentless light of federal testimony. To understand how Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta ended up on that witness stand, we have to roll history backward, away from the moment when cameras finally found him. His journey did not begin with sworn testimony or courtroom sketches. It began decades earlier, in the compact neighborhoods of New York, where Italian surnames crowded the mailboxes and daily life unfolded in a tight radius of apartments, corner stores, and parish churches. It began in a world where organized crime was not an abstract idea or a movie trope, but a visible presence on the sidewalk, a world that shaped the choices of a boy who would become one of the most important cooperators federal prosecutors ever produced against the Colombo family. Unlike some of the more notorious American gangland figures, there is no glossy, fully fleshed-out biography of Salvatore Miciotta's childhood. He was not a celebrity criminal. There were no authorized memoirs, no talk show appearances. What we know of his early life comes indirectly, from his later role as a Brooklyn-based captain in the Colombo organization, from court records that place him firmly in New York's Italian-American underworld, and from the broader social history of the neighborhoods that produced men like him. The absence of detailed personal records is telling in its own way. It reflects the code of privacy and silence that governed the communities in which he grew up, a code that, for much of his life, he respected completely. Mid-20th century New York was a city of enclaves, and the Italian districts of Brooklyn and the outer boroughs formed worlds unto themselves. Families with names like Miciotta had arrived in great numbers in the early decades of the 20th century, fleeing poverty and instability in southern Italy and Sicily. They brought with them dialects, recipes, Catholic devotions, and crucially, a deep suspicion of outside authority. In the tenements of Lower Manhattan and the expanding row house neighborhoods of Brooklyn, they built parallel systems of support, mutual aid societies, parish networks, and, in some corners, reliance on local toughs who could handle problems that the police seemed unable or unwilling to solve. By the time a boy named Salvatore with the last name Miciotta was growing up, that world had already been profoundly shaped by organized crime. The Prohibition era had revealed how much money could be made, and how quickly power could be accumulated by those willing to break the law and keep quiet about it. Out of that chaotic period emerged the structure that still defined New York's underworld when he was a child. The 5 families, among them the organization that would become known as the Colombo family. Under bosses like Joe Prophesy, the forerunner to Colombo, that family built a base of influence in Brooklyn's Italian neighborhoods, taking a cut of businesses, controlling certain unions, and maintaining a latticework of favors and obligations that tied local residents to them, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes eagerly. In these neighborhoods, children learned early how to read the street. They saw which men commanded respect without raising their voices, which cars were always double parked outside the same social club, which adults could get a phone line installed in a day or a job found for a cousin with a single call. Even without being told, they absorbed that there were two ways of getting by: the official route, through schools and civil service exams, and the unofficial one, through relationships with men whose names rarely appeared in the newspaper unless something had gone very wrong. For many parents, the ideal future involved their children leaving that second world behind. But for some boys, especially those who did not see a clear path in the legitimate economy, the signals were mixed. The men who seemed to have money and authority were not the ones standing behind butcher counters or riding the subway to factory jobs. Salvatore would have grown up against this backdrop of tight-knit community and quiet underworld presence. Italian was still heard in kitchens. Older relatives might have struggled with English or felt ill at ease outside the neighborhood. The church offered rituals and a sense of belonging, but it did not pay the rent. New York in the post-war decades was changing fast. Factories closed or moved, longshore work on the docks became precarious, and younger generations watched as the old immigrant bargain, hard work in exchange for stability, frayed at the edges. For many second-generation Italian-American youths, the choice was not between a comfortable professional life and crime. It was between low-paid, insecure work and the allure of something more profitable, more immediate, offered by men who greeted them by name outside the candy store. The Colombo organization understood this environment intimately because it had grown from it. It recruited not through classified ads or formal initiation drives, but through slow, steady observation. A boy who ran errands without complaining might be asked, years later, to drive an older man to the airport. A young man who could keep his mouth shut when questioned about a neighborhood fight might find himself invited into the back room of a social club for coffee and small talk. Long before anyone mentioned the words family or oath, the habits that would define a man's suitability, loyalty, discretion, a willingness to bend rules for friends, were being noted and filed away in the memories of older, more experienced criminals. This atmosphere, the boundary between legitimate and illegitimate activity, could be blurry. A teenager might start by helping out at a relative's storefront, only to discover that behind the scenes, loan payments were being collected for a local captain, or that some of the merchandise on the shelves had arrived without proper paperwork. A minor brush with the law, maybe a fight, a petty theft, or riding in a stolen car, could be smoothed over by an older neighborhood figure who knew people at the precinct. Gratitude and indebtedness wove a web around the youth. The message was subtle but powerful. The official system was rigid and often indifferent, while the unofficial one, run by the men on the corner, was responsive and personal. For someone like Salvatore, whose later position indicates he was not merely a hanger-on but a trusted member of the Colombo hierarchy, those early lessons in loyalty and reciprocity would have been foundational. Whatever the specifics of his childhood, he emerged as a man whom older mobsters believed would follow instructions, keep confidences, and enforce decisions when asked. Those traits did not appear overnight. They were cultivated over years of observation in an environment that valued strength and steadiness, but that also demanded a careful understanding of when to speak and when to remain silent. New York itself was undergoing turmoil as he moved from childhood into adolescence and young adulthood. The 1960s brought civil rights struggles, urban renewal projects that displaced entire blocks, and changing demographics as African American and Puerto Rican families moved into areas that had once been overwhelmingly Italian. Some white ethnic residents left for the suburbs. Others stayed and watched their neighborhoods become more strained and economically precarious. In the midst of this, the Italian-American mafia tried to hold on to its long-standing rackets, gambling, loan sharking, control over certain construction and trucking unions, even as law enforcement began to deploy more sophisticated tools against them. Senate hearings in the 1950s had already exposed the existence of a nationwide criminal network. In 1957, the police raid on the infamous Appalachian meeting in upstate New York made headlines, and slowly the myth that the mafia was just a rumor collapsed. Still, on the ground in Brooklyn, many young men saw that while high-profile bosses occasionally went to prison, the day-to-day street figures continued to operate. Federal laws like the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, RICO, would not begin to truly reshape law enforcement tactics until the 1970s and 1980s. For a boy coming of age in the earlier period, the more immediate concern was getting by in a city where inflation rose, jobs disappeared, and public services often seemed unreliable. In that climate, the quiet, steady presence of organized crime could take on the appearance of stability. Bookmakers paid promptly. Shylock lenders, however predatory their interest rates, delivered cash without forms or bank interviews. A bar or social club backed by a crime family was rarely vandalized. The cost of that stability, of course, was borne by the broader community, in fear, in violence, in the distortion of local economies. But to many who lived there, the system felt familiar and predictable, especially compared to the distant world of banks and bureaucracies. It was into this complicated moral landscape that Salvatore Fat Sal Miciotta stepped as a young man. His later standing as a captain suggests that by the time he reached adulthood, he had already navigated the unspoken tests that separated casual neighborhood toughs from men the family could genuinely rely on. This did not yet make him a boss, or even necessarily a formally inducted member, but it indicated that he was on a path far removed from the straight, law-abiding existence that many Italian-American parents had hoped their children would pursue. Quietly, away from official documents and family photo albums, he was being drawn into a world structured not by written rules but by custom, fear, and opportunity. If his parents or older relatives had misgivings about the direction his life was taking, they left little trace in the historical record. The culture of the time discouraged airing family conflicts in public. What is clear is that, at some point in the late 1960s or 1970s, Salvatore's name began to surface in the confidential notes of law enforcement agents tracking the Colombo family. He was no longer just a face in the crowd at the neighborhood club. He was part of the network, another strand in the intricate web that tied the streets of Brooklyn to larger criminal enterprises across the city. As the Colombo family weathered its own internal struggles, bitter disputes that occasionally flared into open violence, Miciotta's generation of mobsters stepped into roles vacated by older men who went to prison, retired, or died. They were inheriting not only lucrative rackets, but also a legacy of grudges, alliances, and unspoken obligations that stretched back decades. For someone like Salvatore, the upward climb inside the organization would bring money and a certain rough respect, but it would also bind him more tightly to a way of life that left little room for retreat. The same code of silence that had concealed his childhood from public scrutiny would, for many years, protect his criminal activities as well. In later years, when he finally agreed to cooperate with federal authorities, his testimony would help illuminate how men in his position were recruited, trained, and controlled by the crime families that dominated New York's underworld. But in those early days, before he crossed that line, Salvatore Fat Sal Miciotta was simply another product of a specific time and place. A Brooklyn Italian-American world in which organized crime was woven into the fabric of everyday life. The pressures of that environment, the economic uncertainty, the limited social mobility, the visible success of those who flouted the law, formed the backdrop to his choices. They did not excuse what he would later do, but they help explain how a boy from a crowded New York neighborhood could grow into a man whose words, spoken under oath, would shake the foundations of one of America's most enduring criminal organizations. By the time his name was firmly lodged in the notebooks of FBI agents and organized crime prosecutors, the path that had begun in those tight-knit streets had carried him deep into the structure of the Colombo family. The boy who had grown up surrounded by the unspoken power of local men of respect had become one of them, a figure who collected debts, resolved disputes, and carried out orders in the service of a larger criminal enterprise. The journey from silent observer on the sidewalk to participant in that world had taken years, shaped by the social and economic forces of his era as much as by any individual decision. Only later, when the full weight of federal prosecution bore down on him, would he begin to reassess the loyalties that had defined his life since youth. By the mid-1970s, the quiet notes that law enforcement agents kept on Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta, were no longer about a nameless young man seen loitering near a club. Internal reports and surveillance logs had begun to identify him as an active participant in the Colombo family's Brooklyn operations. His presence was consistently noted in the company of recognized soldiers and associates. He appeared at the same social clubs, the same weddings and funerals, the same late-night gatherings that structured the social calendar of New York's Italian-American underworld. Without any public announcement, he had crossed the line from neighborhood figure to a man the authorities regarded as part of the mafia's functioning machinery. This transition did not happen overnight. The Colombo family, like its counterparts, favored long apprenticeships. A young man started small, checking on football bets, running messages, driving older members from one borough to another. He might help collect weekly payments from bookmakers or deliver envelopes of cash to a captain's home or a trusted contact. Each errand tested reliability. Did he show up on time, keep his voice down, follow instructions without improvising? According to FBI and federal court records from later decades, by the time agents were seriously tracking Miciotta, he had already passed enough of these tests to be treated as a dependable hand in the family's Brooklyn sphere. The nickname Fat Sal, which would shadow him through headlines and indictments, emerged during this period. In the mafia world, nicknames were practical. With so many men sharing a handful of common first and last names, a descriptive label helped distinguish one Sal from another. Some nicknames were affectionate, others mocking, some purely functional. For prosecutors and journalists, such names were also useful narrative shorthand, instantly signaling that the person in question belonged to the rough fraternity of New York organized crime. In court papers and trial transcripts, Salvatore Miciotta, also known as Fat Sal, became a fixture. While the public knew little about him, the institutional world he moved in was undergoing significant change. The Colombo family had already survived one round of internal upheaval. Founded under boss Joe Prophesy, it had nearly torn itself apart in the early 1960s when the rebellious Gallo faction rose up against what they saw as Prophesy's greed. That conflict, commonly called the First Colombo War, involved kidnappings, ambushes, and retaliatory attacks on both sides. By the time it subsided and the family reconstituted itself under Joseph Colombo, and later, Carmine, the Snake Persico, the organization had learned the cost of internal strife. Miciotta came of age in the shadow of that history. The older men he dealt with had lived through the Gallo conflict and treated loyalty as a life-and-death matter. Stories of betrayals and shifting alliances circulated in private conversations, shaping how they evaluated younger associates. In such an environment, a man who wanted to progress in the family had to demonstrate not only competence in making money, but steadfastness in the face of pressure. The fact that Salvatore eventually rose to the rank of captain, as government filings would later state, indicates that over time he convinced his superiors that he possessed these qualities. The path to becoming a made man, a formally initiated member of the mafia, was governed by rituals that law enforcement only fully pieced together through later informants. While the exact details of Miciotta's own initiation are not preserved in public records, numerous cooperating witnesses from the same era have described the standard ceremony. A candidate would be taken to a private location by trusted members, his finger pricked so that a drop of blood fell on a holy card, which was then burned in his hands as he repeated oaths of loyalty and silence. He pledged to put the family above all outside authority, to never betray its secrets, and to accept internal discipline without appeal to the law. If Salvatore underwent this rite, as later descriptions of him as a made member imply, it would have marked a decisive point of no return in his relationship with both his community and the state. What is clearer from the documentary record is the nature of the crimes the government associated with him. RICO indictments and related filings from the late 1980s and early 1990s, when he was finally charged, summarized years of alleged activities typical of a Colombo captain. They referenced extortion of legitimate businesses, demands for regular payments in exchange for protection, or for permission to operate without harassment. They cited illegal gambling operations, including numbers games and sports betting, which relied on a network of runners and collectors. They described loan sharking, in which money was lent at high interest rates to individuals and small business owners who often felt they had nowhere else to turn, and who were then pressured, sometimes violently, to keep up with payments. For local shopkeepers and entrepreneurs, this system created a climate of fear and constraint. A bar owner who refused to pay might find shipments delayed, licenses challenged, or customers intimidated until he agreed to terms. A struggling contractor might take a loan from a Colombo-connected lender, only to discover that the repayment schedule made long-term survival nearly impossible. The presence of a captain like Miciotta in a given area signaled that these practices were not random, but organized, a revenue stream for a larger criminal entity. While some community members tolerated or even sought out the services the mafia offered, many others experienced them as a continuous burden, eroding the independence of their businesses and deepening cycles of debt and dependency. Inside the family, though, men like Salvatore were measured less by the suffering their activities caused and more by the stability and income they brought in. In the hierarchy established in the decades after World War II, each captain or capo supervised a crew of soldiers and associates. They were responsible for coordinating their crew's activities, settling internal disputes, and ensuring that a portion of all earnings flowed upward to the administration, the boss, underboss, and consigliere. When later court documents named Miciotta as a captain, they were signaling that he occupied this middle management role in the Colombo structure, high enough to have significant authority, but still subordinate to the ruling regime. The years in which he was consolidating this role were ones of increasing pressure on the mafia from federal authorities. The passage of the RICO statute in 1970 gave prosecutors a powerful new tool, the ability to treat a pattern of criminal acts as part of a single enterprise, allowing them to charge bosses and captains with responsibility for crimes carried out by subordinates, even if they had not personally wielded a weapon or extorted a victim. In the 1980s, landmark trials against other families, like the commission case that targeted the leadership of the Genovese, Gambino, and Lucchese organizations, demonstrated that this strategy could send even the highest-ranking figures to long prison terms. The Colombo family was not spared. Its boss, Carmine Persico, was convicted in 1986 in the commission case and sentenced to what amounted to a life term. Running the family from prison, he relied on trusted lieutenants on the street to manage day-to-day affairs. This arrangement created openings and tensions. On one hand, younger and mid-level figures could rise into more prominent roles as older leaders went away. On the other, disputes about succession and control simmered beneath the surface. For a captain like Miciotta, these years involved balancing loyalty to the Persico regime with the practical need to navigate relationships with other ambitious figures, some of whom chafed at the idea of a boss permanently behind bars. Law enforcement, meanwhile, took a systematic approach to men of his rank. Surveillance teams followed them from social clubs to restaurants to meetings in parking lots. Wiretaps recorded coded conversations about contracts, jobs, and friends that agents painstakingly decoded through context and informant tips. Grand juries issued subpoenas. Some witnesses refused to testify, invoking their right against self-incrimination, while others quietly began to cooperate. In this atmosphere, any experienced mobster understood that the chance of eventually being named in a federal indictment was high. The unwritten code required them to accept this as part of the life. If arrested, they were expected to absorb the punishment in silence rather than provide information about their colleagues. Public records suggest that by the late 1980s, this moment of reckoning had arrived for Salvatore "Fat Sal" Miciotta. His name appeared in federal indictments targeting the Colombo family's racketeering network. These multi-defendant cases laid out in dry legal language the government's view of his position and activities, that he was a captain in good standing, that he directed a crew involved in extortion, gambling, and loan sharking, and that he was part of a criminal organization that used the threat of violence to enforce its will. While the press seized upon the more colorful aspects of the filings, the nicknames, the references to secret meetings, prosecutors were focused on constructing a coherent narrative that would hold up under cross-examination. For Salvatore, the experience of indictment and arrest would have marked a major shift in his daily existence. The life of a free, active captain, moving through the neighborhood, handling disputes, receiving tributes, gave way to the routines of custody, legal consultation, and court appearances. Yet even in this phase, the old norms exerted their pull. Defense attorneys with long experience representing organized crime figures emphasized the importance of a united front. Plea negotiations, if they occurred, were to be limited to sentencing considerations, not to cooperation against others. To break that pattern, to agree to testify for the government, was to cross a line that most in his world considered unforgivable. At this point in the story, however, there is no sign yet of Salvatore making that choice. The man who would one day sit calmly on the witness stand, answering prosecutors' questions in open court, was still, in the eyes of both his comrades and his pursuers, a loyal member of the Colombo family. Internal memoranda from the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI during the early phases of these cases treated him accordingly, as a target to be prosecuted, not a potential witness to be cultivated. Whatever doubts he might have harbored privately about the costs of his lifestyle, they left no trace in the documentary record. Outside the courtroom and the detention centers, the neighborhoods that had shaped him were also changing. By the late 1980s, many Italian-American families had moved out of the old Brooklyn enclaves to Staten Island, New Jersey, or the suburbs. New immigrant groups and younger, more diverse populations filled the vacated apartments and storefronts. The social deference that had once insulated traditional mob figures from open criticism was less secure in these shifting communities. At the same time, the growth of corporate chains and large-scale developers made some of the old rackets less profitable or more difficult to maintain. To stay relevant, captains like Miciotta had to adapt, seeking influence in labor unions, construction, and waste management contracts that touched major projects around the city. These adaptations, in turn, brought them into sharper conflict with federal agencies specializing in labor racketeering and white-collar crime. Investigators from the Department of Labor, the IRS, and other bodies joined the FBI in scrutinizing how union locals were run, how bids were awarded, and where money flowed. Cases that might once have focused on street-level gambling now revolved around bid rigging, no-show jobs, and fraudulent contracts. For a captain, the work became less about overseeing a corner dice game and more about quietly ensuring that a chosen contractor got a city contract or that a union official stayed cooperative. In this more complex environment, the risks of prolonged investigation multiplied. Paper trails could be followed more easily than whispered conversations. Financial records, once properly subpoenaed, could reveal patterns of payoffs and shell companies that were difficult to explain away. It is within this landscape of mounting legal pressure, evolving criminal opportunity, and internal mafia tensions that Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta's career reached its height. The same qualities that had allowed him to rise, a reputation for reliability, a network of relationships, an ability to navigate between violence and negotiation, now made him a figure of intense interest to both his own superiors and the prosecutors determined to dismantle the organization he served. The stage was set for a collision between these forces. On one side stood the ingrained habits and loyalties built over decades in the Colombo world. The oath of silence, the expectation that a man would endure prison rather than betray his associates, the belief that the family, not the government, was the ultimate authority in his life. On the other stood the evolving strategies of the federal justice system, long sentences under RICO, witness protection programs for cooperators, and a growing track record of convincing insiders to break with the past. In the middle was a heavyset Brooklyn captain, known on the street as Fat Sal, whose choices in the years ahead would not only alter his own fate, but help expose the inner workings of one of New York's most entrenched criminal organizations. When the first major racketeering indictment finally landed on Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta, it arrived not as a sudden bolt from the blue, but as the formalization of a threat he had lived with for years. Federal agents had been following him, listening in on his associates, and tracing the flow of cash through businesses tied to the Colombo family. The document that bore his name in the late 1980s and very early 1990s, thick with counts of racketeering, extortion, illegal gambling, and related offenses, represented the government's attempt to turn years of surveillance and informant tips into something that could stand before a jury. The charges carried enormous potential penalties. Under RICO, each predicate act of extortion or loan sharking, each instance in which the threat of violence was used to extract money, contributed to a picture of enterprise corruption that could send a man to prison for decades. Prosecutors did not need to show that a captain had personally carried out an assault or pulled a trigger. It was enough to demonstrate that he directed, approved, or benefited from a pattern of criminal conduct carried out by his crew in service of the family. For someone in Miciotta's position, a Brooklyn capo whose name appeared alongside other reputed Colombo leaders, the stakes were clear from the moment he was brought into federal custody. His daily life contracted sharply. Instead of making the rounds of social clubs and businesses, he now moved within the controlled spaces of detention centers and courtrooms. Meetings with lawyers replaced sit-downs with other captains. Conversations that once revolved around sports bets, union troubles, or neighborhood disputes now focused on discovery materials, plea offers, and the likelihood of conviction. The culture he came from preached endurance. A man was supposed to do his time, refuse to cooperate, and trust that the family would look after his relatives and legal expenses. That was the ethic that had governed the lives of an earlier generation of mobsters, and officially it still held. Yet the world outside his cell was not standing still. While the federal government prepared its cases, the Colombo family itself was sliding toward another internal confrontation. In theory, the line of authority was settled. Carmine, the Snake, Persico, convicted in the commission case and serving what amounted to life in prison, remained the official boss. To keep the family functioning, he had designated an acting boss on the street. For a time, that role was filled by Victor Little Vic Orna, a veteran figure with his own base of support, particularly in Queens and parts of Brooklyn. The arrangement worked only as long as both sides accepted its temporary nature. According to later testimony by multiple cooperating witnesses, Persico intended ultimately to pass control to his son, Alphonse Little Alley Boy Persico, once the younger man had paid his dues and built sufficient standing. Orna, however, had his own ambitions and his own followers. By the end of the 1980s, quiet disagreements over money and appointments had hardened into a deeper question. Would Orna step aside when called upon, or would he attempt to supplant the imprisoned boss's line entirely? The tension exploded in 1991. The exact sequence of meetings and orders remains a matter of interpretation, but the outline that emerged in later trials was stark. Orna was portrayed by prosecutors as having effectively launched a bid for permanent control, while the Persico loyalists saw themselves as defending the family's established leadership. Whatever the initial spark, the result was unmistakable. The Colombo family fractured into two armed camps. Over the next 2 years, New York would witness one of the most violent internecine conflicts in the modern history of American organized crime, a struggle widely referred to as the Third Colombo War. Street-level manifestations of that war were hard to ignore. Drive-by shootings, ambushes in parking lots, and attacks near homes and workplaces left members of both factions dead or wounded. Innocent bystanders were also caught up in the crossfire. Newspapers carried grainy crime scene photographs and quoted anonymous law enforcement officials describing a civil war inside the smallest of the 5 families. For residents of the affected neighborhoods, the violence shattered any lingering notion that the mafia limited its feuds to discrete, isolated settings. The conflict spilled into public spaces, unsettling ordinary routines and bringing an extra layer of fear to streets that had already lived for decades in the shadow of organized crime. From the government's perspective, the war was both a threat and an opportunity. On the one hand, it risked greater harm to civilians and complicated ongoing investigations as targets shifted alliances or disappeared. On the other, it demonstrated to juries and judges just how dangerous these organizations could be when their internal balances collapsed. It also created ideal conditions for recruitment of insiders. Men who might once have accepted long prison terms in the name of a united, disciplined family now watched that family turn its guns inward. The code of silence, already under pressure from long sentences and aggressive prosecution, seemed less compelling when the leadership itself was fractured. Salvatore "Fat Sal" Miciotta stood at the junction of these trends. As a Brooklyn captain, he occupied a middle tier in the Colombo hierarchy, close enough to the leadership to understand the stakes of the Persico, Orna struggle, but also embedded in the practical business of running a crew on the street. Press reports and trial records would later describe him as aligned with the faction loyal to the imprisoned boss, reflecting the long-standing ties many Brooklyn figures had to Persico. Regardless of factional label, what mattered for law enforcement was that he had sat in the rooms where strategy was discussed, heard the justifications each side offered for its actions, and witnessed how quickly personal relationships could be overtaken by the calculus of power. Inside detention facilities, news of shootings and arrests filtered in through visitors, phone calls, and the ever-present television news. Men awaiting trial heard the names of their colleagues announced as victims or suspects, saw images of familiar social clubs cordoned off by police tape, and watched as federal authorities announced new indictments connected to the war. The message was brutal and unambiguous. Even as they faced long prison terms, the organization to which they had pledged loyalty was tearing itself apart elsewhere in the city. It was in this climate that federal prosecutors approached figures like Salvatore with a different kind of proposal. Instead of arguing over minor sentencing concessions in exchange for a quick guilty plea, they offered a more radical bargain. If he was willing to provide truthful, comprehensive information about the Colombo family's operations, its leadership structure, revenue streams, internal discipline, and role in the ongoing war, and if he was prepared to testify publicly against his former associates, the government would consider recommending a reduced sentence, and crucially, would arrange for his protection and relocation under the witness security program. The decision to accept or reject such an offer was not merely legal, it carried immense personal and cultural weight. In the world he came from, to cooperate with the government was to become a traitor. The language used for such men, rats, canaries, conveyed utter contempt. Stories were told with varying degrees of accuracy about what happened to informants who were found by their former colleagues. However, the same culture that condemned cooperation also held out an unwritten promise that those who stayed faithful would be supported while in prison, and that their families on the outside would be looked after by the organization. The war and the intensifying prosecutions had begun to erode confidence in that promise. Salvatore was not the only Colombo figure wrestling with this dilemma. In 1993, the family's consigliere Carmen Sessa, an even higher-ranking official, agreed to cooperate with the government, a decision that sent shockwaves through the underworld. When a man who had served as the family's counselor and conduit to the boss chose to testify, it signaled a profound shift. Sessa's cooperation helped prosecutors map out key meetings, decisions, and acts of violence connected to the war. It also demonstrated that the government could credibly protect even very prominent defectors. Against this backdrop, the calculus facing a captain like Miciotta changed. The sentence he faced, if convicted on all counts, could amount to the rest of his natural life behind bars. The internal war showed that the leadership was unable to protect even its own, and the example of Sessa and others who had begun to cooperate suggested that the chances of remaining in a prison system filled with vengeful, unrepentant loyalists from his own family might diminish as more insiders flipped. The risk of staying silent, once primarily legal and physical, now included the risk of being left as one of the last stand-up guys in a crumbling structure. According to later accounts in court and in the press, it was within this swirl of pressures that Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta chose to cross the line that had defined his life since initiation. He agreed to cooperate with federal authorities. The process began with what prosecutors call proffer sessions, closed-door meetings where a defendant, accompanied by counsel, sits with agents and assistant U.S. attorneys to outline what he knows. The bargain is simple but strict. The witness must tell the truth, fully and consistently, about his own crimes and those of his associates. Any lies or serious omissions discovered later can void the cooperation agreement and expose him to the full range of charges once more. For a man raised in a culture of secrecy, these sessions represented a complete inversion of the old code. Instead of avoiding specifics, he was expected to supply them. Dates of meetings, names of participants, the nature of disputes, the flow of money, the locations of social clubs and safe houses, the mid-level figures whose names rarely appeared in newspapers but whose roles were crucial. As one of the first Colombo captains of his era to flip, he occupied a particularly valuable position. He could describe not just isolated street-level activities, but how decisions traveled down from the leadership to crew bosses, and how profits traveled back up. In return for his cooperation, prosecutors offered a formal agreement. He would plead guilty to a reduced set of charges, still acknowledging his involvement in serious crimes, but with the understanding that his ultimate sentence would reflect the extent and usefulness of his assistance. They would recommend a lower prison term than he might otherwise face, and once his testimony obligations were complete, they would support his entry into the federal witness security program. That program, administered by the U.S. Marshals Service, provided for relocation under a new identity, financial assistance during the transition, and measures to conceal his whereabouts from anyone seeking retribution. The moment word of his cooperation reached the street, the transformation of his reputation within the underworld was instantaneous. A man who had once been addressed as captain and treated with deference at social gatherings was now consigned, in the eyes of his former associates, to the status of permanent outcast. Conversations in social clubs and prison yards used his name as a cautionary example of betrayal. For the government, however, he became something quite different, a key to unlocking the inner workings of a family that, for decades, had relied on silence and intimidation to shield itself from effective prosecution. Agents and prosecutors debriefed him at length about the rackets under his control, which businesses had paid extortion, under what terms, and who had collected, how gambling revenues were calculated and divided, which union locals were influenced by the family, and how that influence was used to steer contracts or secure no-show jobs. He was also questioned extensively about the unfolding war. Even if he had not been physically present for specific shootings, he could explain the logic behind them, who had authorized them, which faction benefited, and how the family attempted to frame or justify the violence to its own members. These debriefings were not one-time events. Over months and years, as new indictments were prepared and new defendants brought to trial, he was repeatedly called upon to clarify details, identify individuals in photographs, and reconcile his recollections with those of other cooperating witnesses. The information he provided was cross-checked against surveillance logs, wiretap transcripts, and financial records. In many instances, his testimony about the meaning of coded phrases on recorded phone calls or the significance of seemingly casual meetings allowed prosecutors to transform ambiguous evidence into a clear narrative of conspiracy. For Salvatore himself, cooperation meant a new and uneasy form of visibility. He had spent his criminal career cultivating a certain kind of anonymity, operating in the spaces between law-abiding society and the shadowy underworld. Now, his name would be read aloud in court not as a defendant alone, but as a witness. Reporters would sketch his appearance and note his words. Former associates would sit a few yards away, listening as he recounted shared histories under oath. The private decisions made in the dim back rooms of Brooklyn clubs were about to be dissected in the bright, orderly realm of federal court. The transformation from silent captain to vocal witness did not erase the harm caused by the activities he had once directed. Businesses he had helped extort and debtors he had helped pressure still carried the consequences of those years. But from the standpoint of historical record, his decision to cooperate marked a turning point. Where once the internal workings of the Colombo family could only be inferred from the outside, now prosecutors, judges, and eventually, the public would hear a detailed account from someone who had lived within that system. It would be through voices like his that the hidden architecture of late 20th century organized crime in New York would finally be laid bare. When Salvatore Fat Sal Miciotta finally walked into a federal courtroom not as a defendant alone, but as a government witness, he crossed a threshold that very few men of his rank in the mafia world had dared to cross. The same room where he had once sat grimly at the defense table, flanked by lawyers, now confronted him from a different angle. He stood at the front, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. For the first time, the secrets of a Colombo captain's life would be laid out in his own voice, under oath, in a public forum. The prosecutors who called him to the stand understood both the power and the vulnerability of a witness like this. On direct examination, their task was to turn years of clandestine activity into a clear, chronological story that a jury with no background in organized crime could follow. They began with the fundamentals: his name, his age, his upbringing, and then, crucially, his rank. Through simple questions, they guided him to confirm that he had been a made member of the Colombo family, and that, over time, he had become a captain responsible for a crew in Brooklyn. Once that basic framework was established, they could move to the specifics of what that role actually meant. What emerged in those long days of testimony was a portrait of the inner workings of the late 20th century mafia that had, until then, been only partially visible to outsiders. Under careful questioning, he explained how captains were assigned territories and revenue-producing schemes, how soldiers and associates were expected to report to their superiors, and how disputes within and between crews were handled. Jurors heard how routine economic activities, running a bar, operating a small construction firm, moving goods by truck, could be transformed into opportunities for illegal profit when a crime family inserted itself as an unofficial regulator and enforcer. He described collections from bookmakers who ran sports betting operations under the family's protection, weekly payments from businesses that had agreed to protection arrangements, and the mechanics of short-term, high-interest loans to struggling shopkeepers and independent contractors. Nothing in his account was cinematic. There were no dramatic flourishes, no romanticized codes of honor. Instead, there was a consistent emphasis on systems and relationships. Who gave instructions, who collected, who delivered envelopes, who mediated when someone fell behind. For judges and juries, this matter-of-fact approach was precisely what made the testimony so valuable. It replaced the fog of rumor and stereotype with a concrete description of criminal organization as a kind of parallel, illicit bureaucracy. Much of what he said would have been familiar in outline to law enforcement professionals who had been studying the mafia for years. But there were important nuances. He could name mid-level figures who had never appeared in headlines but who played critical roles in keeping rackets running smoothly. He could explain how the family took advantage of regulatory blind spots in certain industries, how it exploited personal relationships in labor unions, and how it balanced short-term profit against the need to avoid attracting too much attention from law enforcement. In case after case, his testimony linked otherwise isolated pieces of evidence, wiretapped phone calls, surveillance photographs, bank records, into a coherent narrative. Among the most sensitive portions of his testimony involved the Colombo family's internal conflict at the start of the 1990s. On the stand, he was asked to explain the origins of the split between those loyal to imprisoned boss Carmine Persico and those who rallied around acting boss Victor Orna. Without delving into graphic detail, he recounted the series of meetings, messages, and shifting alliances that led to open war. He described how captains and soldiers were pressed to declare their allegiance, how rumors about planned ambushes and betrayals circulated through the rank and file, and how the fear of being targeted by one's own colleagues altered the daily routines of men who had long considered themselves protected by the invisible boundaries of family. For prosecutors, this part of his account was essential in explaining why the federal government had devoted so many resources to pursuing these cases. It showed that the organization was not simply a loose association of individuals committing isolated crimes, but a structured entity whose internal power struggles could spill into the streets with lethal consequences. By contextualizing the war as the product of leadership decisions and factional maneuvering, he helped jurors see beyond any single act of violence to the broader pattern of conduct that RICO was designed to address. Every step of this process, however, was shadowed by a predictable counterattack from the defense. Lawyers representing his former associates understood that if the jury believed him, the prosecution's case would be enormously strengthened. Their strategy, honed over years of confrontations with cooperating witnesses, was to undermine his credibility by any means available within the rules of evidence. When his direct examination concluded and cross-examination began, the tone in the courtroom shifted. Defense attorneys began by confronting him with his own record. They forced him to repeat, in front of the jury, the litany of crimes he had admitted to in his cooperation agreement: extortion, illegal gambling, loan sharking, participation in a criminal enterprise. They pressed him on any instances where he had lied to law enforcement in the past, any inconsistencies in his early proffer sessions, any benefits he hoped to receive from testifying. Their message to the jury was straightforward. This was a man who had broken the law for years, who had prospered in that life, and who now stood to gain by shifting blame onto others. He could not plausibly deny any of this. The prosecution had already anticipated this tactic by having him acknowledge, during direct examination, the full extent of his wrongdoing and the terms of his cooperation agreement. Under questioning, He confirmed that he hoped his testimony would result in a lighter sentence than he might otherwise receive, and that he had agreed to enter witness protection if the government deemed his assistance substantial. At the same time, he emphasized that the agreement required him to tell the truth, and that any significant lie, once uncovered, could void the arrangement and expose him to the full weight of the charges. Defense lawyers probed his memory for contradictions. They compared his statements on the stand with summaries of his earlier interviews, looking for differences in dates, names, and locations. They suggested that he might be exaggerating certain defendants' involvement to please the prosecution or to settle old scores. In some instances, they highlighted the fact that his accounts were supported mainly by his own word and the government's interpretation of ambiguous evidence. The goal was not necessarily to convince jurors that everything he said was false, but to plant enough doubt that they would hesitate to convict on his testimony alone. The prosecution responded by pointing to the independent corroboration that surrounded key parts of his story. Wiretap recordings captured conversations using the same nicknames and coded language he had explained. Surveillance photographs placed him and certain defendants at the same locations he had described. Bank records showed cash deposits that lined up with the timing of extortion payments he had detailed. In closing arguments, prosecutors often reminded juries that they were not being asked to rely on his word in a vacuum. Instead, they were invited to use his narrative as a framework within which to understand the other evidence. Outside the courtroom, news coverage of these trials introduced Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta to a public that had never heard his name during his years as an active mobster. Articles identified him as a former Colombo captain turned government witness, often nodding his nickname in headlines. Some pieces focused on the broader phenomenon he represented, the willingness of high-ranking mafia members, not just fringe associates, to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for reduced sentences and protection. His decision was discussed alongside that of other prominent defectors of the era, contributing to a sense that the old code of silence was eroding under modern prosecutorial pressure. Within the Italian-American communities that had formed the backdrop of his life, reactions were complex. Many residents, particularly those who had never benefited from the mafia's presence and had only felt its pressure, saw his testimony as a necessary step in curbing the influence of organized crime. For business owners who had paid under-the-table fees for years, the spectacle of a former captain explaining extortion schemes on the record carried a measure of vindication. It confirmed that the burdens they had quietly shouldered were part of a systematic pattern, not random bad luck. Others, steeped in the older culture of neighborhood loyalty and suspicion of government, felt uneasy watching a familiar surname align itself with federal prosecutors, even if they rejected the life he had once led. Inside the underworld, however, there was no ambiguity. Word of his cooperation raced through prison yards and social clubs. His name joined the growing list of men denounced as informants, a list that had become alarmingly long for those who still believed in the traditional code. For the Colombo family, already weakened by internal war and external prosecution, his defection was another serious blow. It deprived them not only of a revenue-producing captain, but of a man who knew in detail how their operations were structured, and who was now willing to describe that architecture to their enemies in court. The concrete impact of his testimony could be seen in the outcomes of the cases where he appeared. In trial after trial linked to the Colombo War and the family's broader racketeering activities, juries returned guilty verdicts against defendants at various levels of the hierarchy. Appellate courts, reviewing challenges to those convictions, repeatedly cited the combination of cooperating witness testimony and corroborating evidence as sufficient to uphold the judgments. While no single witness can be said to have brought down an entire organization, the cumulative effect of insiders like Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta testifying was substantial. It made it far more difficult for defense teams to portray the mafia as a myth or an exaggeration, and for individual defendants to isolate themselves from the enterprise as a whole. For Salvatore himself, these courtroom appearances were only one part of a larger transformation. When he stepped down from the witness stand after each trial, he did not return to the familiar anonymity of a Brooklyn captain's life. Instead, he went back into a controlled, secretive existence within the federal system. He lived under the watch of marshals, moved through secure corridors to and from holding cells, and spent long hours in consultation with prosecutors preparing for the next case. Each successful trial increased the government's investment in protecting him, but it also deepened the distance between him and the world he had once called his own. The emotional cost of that distance is not fully documented in public records. Cooperation agreements and sentencing memoranda mention his assistance, not his private reflections. Yet the broad outlines of his situation are clear. He had cut himself off from an identity, a network, and a way of life that had shaped him since youth. He could no longer safely visit the neighborhoods where he once held sway, or attend the social gatherings that had defined his days. Whatever misgivings he might have had about the path he had taken in his criminal career, they were now joined by the knowledge that, in order to help dismantle the structure he had served, he had permanently severed ties with almost everyone in it. As the 1990s progressed, the wave of prosecutions in which he played a part began to crest. Key figures from both sides of the Colombo conflict received long sentences. The family's ability to project power and maintain coherent control over its traditional rackets was severely undermined. Federal authorities shifted more of their attention to other targets, confident that the combination of RICO, aggressive surveillance, and cooperating witnesses had fundamentally reshaped the landscape of organized crime in New York. Somewhere within that reshaped landscape, under a new identity known only to a small circle of federal officials, lived the man who had once been introduced in court as Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta, a captain in the Colombo family. Behind the legal milestones and headlines, his story stands as a particularly stark example of the arc that defined many mafia careers in the late 20th century. Recruitment from tight-knit ethnic neighborhoods, advancement through a blend of fear and trust, entanglement in increasingly complex criminal enterprises, and finally, collision with an evolved justice system that offered insiders a choice between lifetime imprisonment and cooperation. The public record of his testimony captures only portions of that journey, but those portions are enough to show how deeply the old underworld had been penetrated, and how decisively its reliance on secrecy had been turned against it. When the last of the major trials in which Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta was scheduled to testify finally wound down, the rhythm of his life shifted again. For years, everything had been organized around court dates and preparation sessions. Long hours with prosecutors reviewing transcripts and exhibits, nervous waits in courthouse holding cells, days under bright lights answering questions about events that had once been discussed only in whispers. As verdicts were read and appeal deadlines passed, that phase drew to a close. What remained was the question that had hovered in the background from the moment he agreed to cooperate. How would the legal system ultimately reckon with a man who had spent so much of his life as a criminal organizer, and then so much of it as a key source of information about that same world? The answer took shape in a sentencing hearing, a quieter but in some ways more consequential proceeding than the headline-grabbing trials where he had appeared as a witness. In that hearing, prosecutors and defense counsel filed memoranda and made arguments to a federal judge about what punishment was appropriate. On one side of the ledger stood the seriousness of his admitted conduct, years as a captain in the Colombo family, supervising extortion schemes, illegal gambling operations, and high-interest lending that had trapped many debtors in cycles of fear and obligation. On the other side stood the magnitude of his cooperation, the detailed information he had provided about the family's structure and activities, and the role his testimony had played in securing convictions against other participants in the enterprise. Cooperation of this kind is never treated lightly in federal court. Prosecutors are required to document it carefully, submitting what is known as a 5K11 letter to the judge when they believe a defendant's assistance has been substantial. In such letters, they outline not only the quantity of the witness's cooperation, how many debriefing sessions, how many trials, but also its quality, whether the information was truthful, whether it opened new investigative leads, whether it helped to convict individuals who might otherwise have escaped accountability. In cases like Salvatore, they also confront the uncomfortable fact that the same traits that made him a valuable criminal organizer, his knowledge of the hierarchy, his close relationships with other captains and soldiers, are what now make him valuable to law enforcement. For the judge, sentencing a man like him meant navigating between extremes. To ignore or minimize his past crimes would risk sending a message of leniency to others involved in organized crime. To ignore his cooperation would undercut one of the most effective tools the government had developed to penetrate tightly knit criminal organizations. Judges in similar cases have spoken on the record about this tension, acknowledging the distaste many feel about reducing penalties for individuals who have committed serious offenses, while also recognizing that without such incentives, deeply entrenched criminal networks would be far harder to dismantle. In Salvatore Micciotta's case, the outcome reflected that balancing act. Public reporting and subsequent references in legal literature indicate that he received a sentence far below what he might have faced had he gone to trial and refused to cooperate, yet still significant enough to recognize the gravity of his conduct before turning witness. The exact terms are less important than what they symbolized. The court's formal acknowledgement that he had been both a perpetrator and, later, an essential source in bringing other perpetrators to justice. In granting a reduced term, the judge effectively endorsed the bargain struck by the government with one of the mafia's former insiders. From the standpoint of traditional underworld values, of course, this endorsement meant little. In the code Salvatore had once embraced, prison terms were to be faced without complaint as part of the life. Aid from the state was to be rejected in favor of loyalty to the family. But that code had already been eroded by the very pressures that had convinced him to flip. Long mandatory sentences, the visible breakdown of family unity during the Colombo War, and the example of other high-ranking figures who had chosen cooperation. His sentencing hearing thus marked not just a personal milestone, but another small step in the broader historical process, by which the old mafia ideal of unconditional silence was giving way to a harsher reality in which self-preservation often prevailed. Once the judge pronounced sentence, a new phase began, one less documented in the public record but no less real. With his cooperation obligations largely fulfilled and his punishment formally set, arrangements had to be made for his long-term protection. The U.S. Marshals Service, which administers the federal witness security program, had been involved in his case from the moment he agreed to testify. Now, their role shifted from escorting him to and from court under guard to helping him construct an entirely new existence. The details of where he went and under what name are, by design, not publicly known. That secrecy is crucial to the program's effectiveness. However, accounts from other former organized crime figures who entered witness protection provide a sense of what such a transition typically involves. A protected witness, and if they choose, certain immediate family members are relocated to a new region, often far from the urban centers where they once lived and operated. They are given new identities, complete with documentation, and are assisted in finding housing and, eventually, employment. For someone like Salvatore, whose adult life had been spent in the close-knit, highly stratified world of New York's Italian-American neighborhoods and mafia social clubs, the cultural adjustment would have been profound. The program offers material support, but it cannot erase the psychological weight of what has been left behind. A man who had once commanded a crew, mediated disputes, and walked streets where his presence was known and noted must learn to live as an ordinary citizen among people who have never heard his name. Casual conversations about background and family must be navigated carefully to avoid revealing too much. Holidays once spent with large extended clans in familiar surroundings may now be observed quietly and anonymously. Even small details, an accent, a set of mannerisms, a way of carrying oneself, can feel like vulnerabilities when one has reason to fear being recognized by those who might wish to do harm. The irony of this situation is striking. For years, secrecy had been his ally, allowing him and his associates to operate outside the law, communicating in coded language and hiding their activities behind legitimate fronts. After his cooperation, secrecy became his shield in a different sense, a means of keeping his whereabouts and new identity hidden from those same associates, whose trust he had forfeited by taking the stand. The state that had once pursued him now bore responsibility for maintaining this new layer of invisibility. Meanwhile, the ripple effects of his testimony and that of other cooperating Colombo members continued to spread through the legal system. The successful prosecutions in which he had played a role were cited in training materials for younger prosecutors and agents as case studies in how to build RICO cases against organized crime groups. Law Review articles analyzing the decline of traditional mafia power in New York during the 1990s and early 2000s pointed to the combination of extended sentences, financial investigations, and insider cooperation as key factors. His name appeared in footnotes and summaries alongside those of higher-profile defectors from other families, part of a mosaic of insider accounts that had collectively demystified much of the mafia's internal structure. The Colombo family itself, though not destroyed, emerged from this period battered and diminished. Its leadership ranks had been thinned by death, long prison sentences, and defections. The Third War had cost it not only personnel but also credibility in the eyes of other criminal organizations, who had watched one of the five families descend into disorder. Law enforcement, armed with detailed maps of the family's hierarchy and rackets, had targeted many of its most profitable traditional schemes. Though new members would inevitably attempt to rebuild aspects of its influence, the conditions that had once allowed captains like Salvatore to flourish, relative law enforcement inattention, communities inclined to tolerate or fear mafia presence, a strong economic niche for labor and construction racketeering in a heavily industrial city, had changed significantly. For historians and sociologists examining this era, his trajectory became a useful lens through which to understand the broader transformation of organized crime. He embodied the classic pattern of second or third generation Italian-American men drawn into the mafia during the mid-20th century, shaped by ethnic enclaves, disillusioned by limited legitimate opportunities, and attracted by the status and income offered by affiliation with a crime family. At the same time, his decision to cooperate and enter witness protection highlighted how those very networks were being reshaped by shifts in law enforcement, economics, and community norms. The fact that a captain, a man who had taken the initiation oath, enforced its rules, and benefited from its protection, could ultimately choose to work with the state against his former colleagues underscored just how fragile the old codes had become. Not everyone accepted this narrative of decline uncritically. Some argued that focusing too heavily on high-profile cooperators risked overstating the extent to which organized crime had been dismantled, ignoring its adaptability and the emergence of new groups with different ethnic and organizational profiles. Others pointed out that while traditional Italian-American families like the Colombos had undeniably lost much of their prominence, the underlying social conditions that had nurtured them, economic inequality, demand for illicit services, corruption in certain sectors, had not disappeared. From this perspective, the story of Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta, was not simply a tale of one man's rise and fall, but a chapter in a longer, still unfinished history of organized criminal activity in American cities. Within the Italian-American communities from which the old mafia had drawn much of its membership, his example also sparked quieter forms of reflection. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, younger generations were coming of age with very different reference points than their parents and grandparents. Many pursued higher education, moved into professional fields, and settled in suburbs far removed from the cramped blocks of Brooklyn or the Lower East Side. For them, the world of captains and social clubs, of coded conversations and neighborhood men of respect, was something encountered more often on television than in daily life. The fact that a man like Salvatore had ended up as a government witness, hidden somewhere under a new name, reinforced the perception that whatever rough glamour the mafia had once projected, it ultimately led to isolation, imprisonment, or both. At the same time, the persistence of certain romanticized images in popular culture created an odd dissonance. Films and series continued to depict fictionalized mob figures wrestling with loyalty and betrayal, sometimes emphasizing their family lives and personal codes in ways that sidestepped the full impact of their crimes on ordinary people. Against this backdrop, the plain, procedural language of court transcripts featuring witnesses like Fat Sal offered a sobering counterpoint. There in black and white were the mechanics of how extortion operated, how union corruption raised costs and undermined fair labor practices, how the threat of harm, without needing to be detailed, hung over every transaction. The gap between the stylized versions of mob life and the lived reality documented in those records was wide. As for Salvatore himself, the public trail of his story runs largely cold after his formal cooperation period ended. That silence is intentional. The success of witness protection depends on it. Occasionally, his name surfaces in retrospective accounts of the Colombo War or in broader works about the decline of the American mafia, usually as part of a list of key cooperators whose testimony had major impact. Beyond that, he exists mainly as a case file and a set of transcripts, his current circumstances known only to a handful of government officials bound by confidentiality. From a historical perspective, however, the arc of his life remains instructive. It illustrates the interplay between individual choice and structural forces, how a boy from an immigrant background neighborhood, shaped by the economic and social conditions of post-war New York, could move into organized crime, how changing legal frameworks and internal organizational conflicts could, decades later, push that same man to assist in dismantling the structure that had once defined his identity. It also underscores the limits of any single narrative. His story is not that of every Colombo insider, nor does it capture the full diversity of experiences within Italian-American communities touched by the mafia. But it does provide a detailed, documented window into one route through that world, from early immersion to deep entanglement to eventual and irrevocable break. For those trying to understand the tension that opened this documentary, the image of a former captain, heavyset and composed, speaking into a courtroom microphone while fellow mobsters' relatives watch from the benches, his path offers essential context. He did not arrive at that moment by accident or in isolation. He was the product of a specific era, a specific organization, and a specific set of decisions made at critical junctures, both by himself and by the institutions around him. In tracing that path from Brooklyn streets to federal witness, we can better grasp how the larger story of organized crime in America has unfolded, not as a series of disconnected sensational events, but as the cumulative outcome of countless individual lives shaped by their time and place. In the years after Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta slipped into the machinery of witness protection. The man himself receded from view, but the record of what he had said did not. In federal buildings in Brooklyn and Manhattan, in the offices of prosecutors and FBI supervisors. Thick binders and cardboard boxes held the fruits of his cooperation. Proffer notes, trial transcripts, investigative diagrams built from his recollections. For those who had spent decades trying to pierce the inner circle of the Colombo family, these documents represented a rare achievement. They transformed rumors and partial insights into a structured, first-hand account of how a mid-level mafia hierarchy actually worked in late 20th century New York. Agents and attorneys who had sat across from him in windowless conference rooms now used his information as a reference point. When new informants emerged, or when wiretaps picked up references to unfamiliar names and locations, investigators could cross-check them against what he had already described. His testimony about how money flowed from the street to the administration, how captains coordinated among themselves, and how the family managed its relationships with union officials and business owners provided a kind of template. Even after his own cases were resolved, that template helped shape the strategy for future investigations, not only against the Colombos, but against other criminal organizations that displayed similar patterns of structure and behavior. This institutional use of his cooperation highlighted a larger transformation in how law enforcement approached organized crime. In the 1950s and 1960s, efforts to attack the mafia had focused heavily on visible street activity and the most flamboyant leaders. Raids on social clubs, high-profile arrests of bosses, and televised hearings. By the time Salvatore agreed to talk, the philosophy had shifted. Prosecutors cared as much about long-term institutional memory as about any single conviction. Each insider who flipped, each new stack of debriefing notes, was understood as a piece in a larger, accumulating picture of how these groups survived, adapted, and integrated themselves into various sectors of the economy. Within this broader shift, his cooperation stands as an early example of something that would become increasingly common: the use of mid-level insiders, not just top bosses or fringe associates, as central narrators in RICO cases. A boss might know overarching strategy but be insulated from day-to-day operations. A low-level associate might witness particular acts but have little sense of the structure above him. Captains like Miciotta, positioned between leadership and the street, could speak to both. They knew which orders came from higher up and how those orders translated into specific acts on the ground. For federal agencies, securing the cooperation of figures at that level became a priority. At the same time, the very success of this approach spurred its critics. Defense attorneys, civil libertarians, and some legal scholars raised serious questions about the growing reliance on cooperating witnesses who were themselves deeply implicated in crime. The basic concern was straightforward. When a man facing decades in prison is offered a chance at a lighter sentence in exchange for information, he has a strong incentive to tell the government what it wants to hear. Even with cross-examination and corroborating evidence, skeptics argued, deals of this kind risked introducing distortions into the fact-finding process. These debates played out in law review articles and judicial opinions, but they were grounded in very concrete realities. In trials where Salvatore testified, defense lawyers hammered away at the bargain he had made. You committed serious offenses, they reminded him and the jury, and look at what you're getting in return. The counterargument, refined over years of similar cases, was that without such bargains, long-entrenched criminal organizations would remain largely immune to effective prosecution. Publicly available appellate decisions upholding convictions in the Colombo cases often addressed this tension directly, concluding that when cooperating witnesses were subjected to searching cross-examination, and their accounts were supported by independent evidence, their testimony could fairly be used. For victims, business owners who had paid under-the-table fees, workers whose unions had been corrupted, families who had lived in fear, the ethical calculus was more personal. Some found it hard to accept that a man who had helped enforce extortion schemes could receive a lesser sentence because he later cooperated. Others took a more pragmatic view. If using one wrongdoer's testimony helped hold many others accountable and weakened the larger structure that had harmed their communities, then the compromise, however imperfect, was justified. Over time, as more and more mafia insiders across different families chose cooperation, this uneasy balance between principle and practicality became a standard feature of the American criminal justice system's response to organized crime. Nowhere were the consequences of this shift more evident than inside the Colombo family itself. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, the organization was a shadow of what it had been when Salvatore first began his ascent. The Third War had claimed lives and exposed fissures. Federal indictments had swept up leaders from both factions, and cooperating witnesses, among them a consigliere like Carmen Sessa and a captain like Fat Sal, had given prosecutors detailed maps of the family's internal workings. Subsequent cases against remaining figures, including members of the Persico line who tried to maintain control from prison, were built in part on the foundation laid by these earlier cooperators. This did not mean that the Colombo family vanished overnight. Organized crime, by its nature, is adaptive. New recruits appeared, old rackets were modified, and entirely new schemes were attempted. But the conditions that had allowed someone like Salvatore to function as a relatively secure neighborhood power were gone. Law enforcement attention was more intense. Surveillance technology, from wiretaps to hidden microphones, was more sophisticated. Sentencing guidelines were harsher, and the pool of potential cooperators had grown. Within that environment, any would-be captain had to reckon with the strong likelihood that, if indicted, one or more of his own associates might choose the same path that Fat Sal had taken. For federal authorities, this new reality was both a victory and a challenge. On the one hand, the combination of RICO, long sentences, and insider testimony had clearly weakened the old mafia structure. On the other, the fragmentation of criminal activity into smaller, more fluid groups, often crossing ethnic and national lines, made it harder to apply the same template everywhere. Italian-American families like the Colombos had distinctive hierarchies and traditions, including formal initiation ceremonies and a shared culture of neighborhood roots. Those features made them vulnerable to certain investigative strategies, but newer criminal organizations, from transnational drug networks to loosely organized street gangs, often operated differently. The lessons learned from debriefing men like Salvatore had to be adapted, not simply repeated. In academic circles, the cumulative record of these debriefings and trials began to filter into scholarship. Criminologists and historians writing about the decline of the traditional American mafia drew on court transcripts, sentencing memoranda, and investigative reports. While not every scholar cited Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta by name, the type of information he had provided about crew structure, revenue streams, internal discipline, and decision-making during times of crisis underpinned many analyses. Books and articles charted the transition from the heyday of the five families, when bosses like Carlo Gambino or Vito Genovese had commanded broad influence, to the more fragmented, embattled landscape of the 1990s and beyond. Some commentators were careful to emphasize that decline did not mean disappearance. They pointed out that even diminished mafia families could still inflict significant economic and social harm, especially in specific industries where they retained footholds. They noted, too, that the erosion of one kind of organized crime often coincided with the rise of others, including large-scale fraud schemes and cyber-enabled offenses that bore little resemblance to the cash envelope extortion and gambling operations of earlier decades. In this evolving picture, the story of a man like Fat Sal became simultaneously a marker of an ending, of a certain form of neighborhood-anchored mafia life, and a prelude to a more diffuse, harder to define criminal landscape. Within Italian-American communities, the weakening of the old mafia presence opened space for narratives that had long struggled to be heard. For decades, many residents had bristled at the way popular culture, and some news coverage seemed to treat organized crime as an almost defining feature of their ethnicity. Activists, clergy, and community leaders had repeatedly argued that the vast majority of Italian Americans lived law-abiding lives, and resented the small minority who leveraged shared heritage as a shield for illegal activity. The downfall of high-profile mob figures, aided by insider witnesses, reinforced their point. These men were not representatives of the community's values, but self-interested actors whose choices had often harmed their own neighbors. Yet the complicated emotions that surrounded cooperation remained. In some older circles, especially among those who had grown up with a deep suspicion of government and a strong attachment to neighborhood loyalty, there was a lingering discomfort with the idea of turning to federal authorities, even against men whose conduct they despised. This ambivalence surfaced in private conversations rather than public demonstrations, but it speaks to the enduring cultural weight of concepts like omertà, even as the practical hold of the mafia itself weakened. The case of Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta sat squarely in the middle of these cross pressures. He was an insider who had unquestionably harmed people through his criminal activities, and he was also the insider who had, in the eyes of the law, helped bring some measure of accountability to that same world. From a moral standpoint, assessing such a trajectory is difficult. Legal systems are designed to weigh acts and consequences, not to produce neat redemptive narratives. Cooperation agreements do not require remorse, they require information. Some cooperating witnesses express genuine regret for their past actions, while others speak primarily in terms of practical necessity. Public records of Salvatore's statements focus on factual recounting, not on his inner emotional life. What can be said with confidence is that his decisions carried real consequences. For the men he testified against, for the institutions that relied on his information, and for the communities affected by the dismantling of parts of the Colombo apparatus. In retrospect, one of the most striking aspects of his story is how ordinary many of its elements are when stripped of the aura that popular culture often attaches to organized crime. His early life followed familiar immigrant neighborhood patterns. His rise depended on the mundane skills of organizing, enforcing, and cultivating relationships. His fall came through the equally mundane operations of surveillance, arrest, bargaining, and testimony. There were no master plans, no cinematic showdowns, only a sequence of choices made within the constraints and opportunities of a particular time and place. That ordinariness is precisely what gives his story its value as a historical case study. It demonstrates that the forces that create and dismantle criminal organizations are woven into the everyday fabric of economic and social life. Meanwhile, somewhere far from the Brooklyn streets where he had once been known simply as Fat Sal, the man behind that nickname had to construct a daily routine under an assumed name. If he followed the pattern of many witnesses in the program, he likely faced the challenge of finding legal work after years in a criminal economy, of keeping a low profile in communities oblivious to his past, of living with the knowledge that his safety depended on a combination of federal safeguards and personal caution. The government's responsibility was to protect him from physical retaliation. It could not erase the accumulated weight of memory or restore the relationships severed by his cooperation. To those charged with telling the story of organized crime's evolution in America, his journey remains a crucial thread. It connects the tight, insular world of mid-century Italian-American neighborhoods to the expansive, document-driven realm of federal prosecution. It links the informal authority of a local captain to the formal authority of a courtroom, where that same captain's words become part of the public record. And it shows, perhaps more clearly than any abstract theory could, how the combination of legal innovation, institutional persistence, and individual decisions can reshape even the most entrenched criminal institutions. By the time the 21st century was well underway, younger prosecutors and agents studying the history of the Colombo family encountered Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta, not as a living presence, but as a name in case files and training lectures. They learned that he had once been a source of fear and deference in a particular slice of Brooklyn, and that later, in a very different setting, he had become a source of information that helped dismantle the very structure that had elevated him. In this way, his life story, preserved in transcripts and legal opinions, continued to influence the ongoing conversation about how societies confront organized crime, and about the complicated, often uncomfortable alliances they sometimes forge with those who once sustained it. By the time a decade had passed since Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta first took the witness stand, his physical presence had faded from public view, but the outline of his life remained etched into the institutional memory of the people who had dealt with him. His name appeared not on fresh indictment sheets, but in internal memoranda, trial manuals, and case studies used to teach younger prosecutors how an insular, violent organization could be methodically taken apart. The man who had once overseen a crew in Brooklyn now existed, for most who thought about him, as a collection of transcripts and a cautionary example, part of the story the justice system told itself about what had worked and why. His detailed account of the Colombo family's structure during the years leading up to and through the Third War gave investigators a model they could return to long after the individual cases were closed. Charts that had once been hand-drawn on whiteboards in preparation for his testimony, boxes and arrows marking captains, soldiers, associates, were preserved in case files. When agents in later years came across a new surname on a wiretap or in a confidential informant's report, they sometimes found that it had already appeared in those older diagrams. They could see, at a glance, who that person had once reported to, which crews they had interacted with, and how money had flowed in and out of their orbit. The Third Colombo War itself became a reference point far beyond the boroughs where it had been fought. In law enforcement circles, it was studied as a textbook example of how internal power struggles in a hierarchical criminal organization could erupt into public violence, and how those same struggles, when combined with sustained external pressure, could make the group unusually vulnerable. Prosecutors used the war to illustrate the concept of an enterprise under RICO. Two factions, both insisting they were the legitimate leadership, drawing on the same pool of soldiers and the same rackets, fighting over control of revenue streams that had been built, in part, by men like Fat Sal. In this narrative, his cooperation played a dual role. First, it helped secure convictions for specific acts, extortions, conspiracies, and decisions that had led to shootings. Second, it turned the war into something that could be explained, step by step, to judges and juries. Instead of presenting the conflict as a blur of incidents, prosecutors could show how disputes over succession, money, and respect at the top of the hierarchy translated into commands and retaliations lower down. Without that kind of inside account, the war might have remained a loosely understood tragedy. With it, it became an analyzable event, a case from which patterns could be drawn and applied to other investigations. Over the same period, RICO itself matured from a relatively new, somewhat experimental statute into a standard tool in the federal kit. Early RICO cases had been fraught with uncertainty. Judges were still interpreting the law's reach, defense lawyers were challenging its constitutionality, and prosecutors were testing how broadly enterprise and pattern of racketeering activity could be defined. By the time Salvatore's cooperation was complete, many of those battles had been fought. Appellate decisions citing cases against the Colombos, some of which relied heavily on his and other insiders' testimony, had clarified key points of doctrine. In training sessions, senior prosecutors could now say not just, "This is what the law allows," but "This is how we know it works," because here is a family we dismantled using precisely this approach. The combination of external legal pressure and internal factionalism that had brought the Colombo family low was mirrored, in different forms, across the American mafia. Other families experienced their own upheavals, some driven by succession disputes, others by financial shifts that made old rackets less profitable. In each case, the government's evolving strategy relied on persuading at least some insiders to go the route that Fat Sal had gone, to sit in a secure room, point to names on a chart, and explain how a world defined by codes of silence and loyalty actually functioned. His case, while not as famous as that of Sammy, the Bull, Gravano and the Gambino family, or Joe Valachi a generation earlier, stood alongside theirs as evidence that initiation oaths and long-standing norms no longer guaranteed a wall of silence. The differences were instructive. Valachi in the 1960s had been the first major insider to publicly acknowledge the existence of Cosa Nostra, but he had not been a high-ranking figure. His knowledge was real but limited. Gravano, by contrast, had been the underboss of the most powerful family of his era, and his testimony against John Gotti made global headlines. Salvatore occupied a middle space, not a household name, not the head of a family, but undeniably part of its management layer. He represented the ordinary functioning backbone of the organization, the kind of man whose knowledge, multiplied across many cases and many witnesses, allowed the justice system to move from symbolic blows against figureheads to sustained campaigns against the mafia's infrastructure. This shift reverberated outwards into the communities that had once been the mafia's core recruiting grounds. In parts of Brooklyn, Queens, and Staten Island, where Colombo captains had once quietly overseen bookmaking and protection rackets, the 1990s and early 2000s brought different pressures. Some neighborhoods experienced gentrification, with rising rents and new demographics displacing long-time residents. Others struggled with deindustrialization, public sector cutbacks, and waves of newer immigrants facing many of the same dilemmas that Italian families had confronted generations earlier. The visible presence of traditional mob figures, men holding court at storefront social clubs, crews gathering publicly outside certain cafes, declined. For younger Italian Americans, the world that had shaped Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta seemed increasingly distant. Many of them attended universities their grandparents could scarcely have imagined, worked in professions that took them far from the old neighborhoods, and consumed media that presented the mafia as a kind of stylized mythology rather than a present threat. At family gatherings, older relatives might allude obliquely to guys from the block who had gotten in trouble years back, but the immediacy was gone. The notion that a cousin might be quietly collecting envelopes for a local captain, or that a parishioner's bar was paying weekly tribute to a crew, no longer matched the lived realities of most. Yet the cultural imprint of the era in which Salvatore had risen did not disappear. Films and television shows continued to mine mafia history for storylines, sometimes drawing loosely on real events like the Colombo War, sometimes constructing composite characters that blended traits from multiple historical figures. In these portrayals, cooperating witnesses were often cast as tragic figures, torn between loyalty and self-preservation, or as plot devices whose decision to testify set climactic betrayals in motion. The actual mechanics of proffer sessions, protective custody, and witness security logistics rarely appeared. What mattered narratively was the moral drama. Viewed against this backdrop, the real story preserved in court transcripts can feel almost austere. When Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta described his life on the stand, he did so in the dry, factual tone encouraged by prosecutors. Times, places, names, roles. There were no monologues about conscience or elaborate justifications, only an insistence on having been a loyal soldier until circumstances changed, and on now telling the truth as part of a legally binding agreement. Where popular culture might linger on moments of high emotion, the historical record dwells instead on the accumulation of routine acts. How many payments were collected on a given route, how disputes over territory were negotiated, how information about a potential target moved up and down the chain of command. For scholars and journalists trying to construct a reliable picture of organized crime, this very lack of embellishment is what makes accounts like his so valuable. Earlier eras had relied heavily on sensationalistic reporting, rumor, and the occasional dramatic revelation. With the wave of cooperators in the late 1980s and 1990s, including figures from the Colombos, the raw material changed. Instead of a few high-profile exposés, there were hundreds of hours of sworn testimony available in public records, much of it delivered by men like Fat Sal, who had no interest in becoming public personalities. They were there because they had signed an agreement with the government, not because they were seeking book deals or media platforms. Even so, the use of such testimony raised ongoing policy questions. Lawmakers and legal scholars debated whether the incentives offered to cooperators were calibrated correctly. Had sentencing guidelines grown so harsh that cooperation became, for some, less a matter of conscience than of stark survival? Were there sufficient safeguards to ensure that witnesses did not exaggerate or invent in order to please prosecutors? Cases in which cooperators were later found to have lied, or in which their accounts conflicted sharply with other evidence, fueled these concerns. Against that backdrop, every insider who took the stand was to some degree a test of the system's ability to balance pragmatism and truth-seeking. In this respect, the relative lack of public controversy over Salvatore's testimony is notable. While defense attorneys in his cases attacked his credibility with all the tools at their disposal, appellate courts reviewing those trials did not find that his presence had fundamentally tainted the proceedings. Instead, they treated him as one component in a larger evidentiary mosaic, alongside wiretap recordings, surveillance reports, and financial documents. This does not mean his account was taken on faith. It means that, when scrutinized through the formal channels of the justice system, it held up well enough to support convictions that withstood later legal challenges. Another lasting impact of his cooperation, and that of others like him, can be seen in the evolution of witness protection practices themselves. When the Federal Witness Security Program was first established in the early 1970s, largely as a response to early mafia defectors, it was an untested experiment. Over time, dealing with men who had lived much of their lives outside the law forced the Marshals Service to refine its protocols. Cases like Salvatore's underscored the need for thorough psychological screening, realistic planning for post-cooperation employment, and clear communication about the limits of what the state could and could not provide. Witnesses came in expecting a clean slate and often discovered that anonymity, while a powerful shield, did not automatically resolve issues of identity, guilt, or adjustment. Publicly available evaluations of the program have generally concluded that it has been highly successful at its core mission, protecting witnesses from physical retaliation, while acknowledging significant challenges in the broader task of helping them build stable, lawful lives. In that assessment, men like Fat Sal appear as both beneficiaries and stress tests. Their survival under new identities demonstrates that even high-profile mafia insiders can be effectively hidden. Their difficulties, hinted at in occasional off-the-record comments by officials or in leaked anecdotes about former participants, show how complicated it is to uproot someone from one tightly bounded world and drop them into another. Internationally, the approach pioneered in cases like his influenced how other countries thought about organized crime. European states grappling with their own entrenched criminal groups, whether Italian mafias, Balkan networks, or others, looked closely at the American model of combining enterprise-based laws with structured witness protection systems. In Italy, long-standing anti-mafia efforts were reshaped in part by the use of pentiti, or repentant former members, whose testimony bore some resemblance to that of American cooperators. While the legal frameworks differed, the underlying insight was similar. Organizations that rely on secrecy and fear can be destabilized when key insiders are given credible alternatives to silence. Amid these broad currents, the specific figure of Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta began to recede into the background. New names, new cooperators, new defendants, new criminal organizations rose to prominence. Analysts tracing the decline of the traditional five families now spoke in terms of trajectories and trends, with individual cases serving as illustrative points on a larger graph. In that graph, his life formed one of the data points marking the steep drop-off in the influence of the Colombo family's Brooklyn cruise in the 1990s. Yet even as he became one entry among many, there was something instructive about how unexceptional his story looked when placed alongside those of other cooperators. He had not been a flamboyant boss or a flamboyant rebel. He had followed a fairly standard path through the mafia's ranks, responded to legal pressure in a way increasingly common among men of his generation, and then faded into protected obscurity. This very ordinariness underscores a central lesson of the period. The dismantling of traditional organized crime in America was not the result of a few dramatic defections alone, but of many mid-level actors making similar, individually unremarkable choices that, collectively, weakened the entire structure. Looking back at that winter morning in the Brooklyn courtroom when he leaned toward the microphone to speak, it is tempting to frame his life in terms of a sharp before and after. The years as Fat Sal the captain, then the years as Salvatore the cooperator under an assumed name. Historically, though, the continuity may be more revealing than the rupture. In both phases, he operated within systems that demanded loyalty and secrecy, first the mafia, then the witness protection program. In both, his value lay in his relationships and his willingness to abide by rules set by others. And in both, his story illuminates how individuals navigate powerful institutions, sometimes reinforcing them, sometimes helping to dismantle them, but rarely shaping them entirely on their own. The documentary trail that follows him winds through neighborhood streets, jail cells, courtrooms, and finally into the closed files of federal agencies. Along the way, it captures something larger than the fate of a single man. It traces the arc of a distinct chapter in American urban history, the rise, entrenchment, and partial unraveling of an organized crime system that had once seemed immovable. That arc and his place within it sets the stage for considering what came next, for the Colombos, for the communities they once dominated, and for a justice system that had learned, through cases like his, both the power and the limits of turning former insiders into witnesses. Long after Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta's own story slipped behind the curtain of witness protection, the consequences of his choices continued to unfold quietly in the spaces he had once helped shape. In parts of Brooklyn where his name had once carried a particular weight, the physical reminders of that era slowly disappeared. Social clubs where captains met behind smoked glass shutters became nail salons, coffee chains, or empty storefronts in search of new tenants. The men who used to linger on folding chairs outside, greeting passers-by with nods that signaled both welcome and warning, were gone, some dead, some imprisoned, some like him, living under names that no one in the old neighborhood would recognize. For residents who had grown up in those streets, the change could feel disorienting. In the 1970s and 1980s, everyone knew which corners were theirs, which belonged to other crews, and which were best avoided altogether. The informal boundaries layered on top of the city map were part of how people navigated daily life. By the early 21st century, many of those invisible lines had faded. New arrivals moved into apartments without any awareness that, decades earlier, a Colombo captain like Fat Sal had considered their block part of his domain. The threats that preoccupied them now, rising rents, school zoning, public safety in a broader urban sense, had little to do with the old mafia codes. Yet the absence of those earlier pressures did not mean that their impact was forgotten. In small businesses that had managed to survive from one generation to the next, memories lingered. An older shopkeeper might remember the anxiety of envelope days, when someone from a captain's crew stopped by to collect rent that was not listed on any lease. A retired union man might recall contracts skewed by decisions made not in boardrooms, but in the back rooms of places where men like Salvatore held court. For such people, reading about the Colombo trials in the 1990s and hearing that a former captain had broken ranks to testify produced a complicated mix of reactions. Vindication that their private fears had been real, and unease at the thought of anyone speaking openly about a world they had been trained since childhood not to discuss. This tension between silence and speech, loyalty and law, lies at the heart of any attempt to assess the legacy of figures like Fat Sal. For most of his adult life, his value within the Colombo family derived from his ability to enforce silence on himself, on his crew, on those who came under his sway. His shift to cooperation meant that his value to the state derived from the opposite capacity, to speak in detail about the very practices he had once worked to conceal. Historically, this inversion is striking. It shows how structures built to rely on fear and secrecy can, over time, be turned inside out by the very people they once depended on most. The broader legal legacy of his era can be seen in how routinely concepts like enterprise corruption, pattern of racketeering activity, and cooperating witness are now invoked in major criminal cases. During the years when Salvatore rose through the Colombo ranks, these ideas were still being solidified in case law. By the years after he testified, they had become familiar parts of the prosecutorial landscape. Judges had set precedents about how much corroboration was required for insider testimony, how far a RICO indictment could reach, and what kinds of criminal organizations could be treated as enterprises under the statute. The Colombo prosecutions, built in part on what men like Fat Sal revealed, helped anchor those doctrines. At the same time, the system's reliance on cooperators led to ongoing reforms meant to prevent abuse. Internal Justice Department guidelines grew more detailed about how plea agreements with cooperating defendants should be crafted, what disclosures had to be made to the defense, and how to document the full extent of a witness's own crimes. Courts demanded that prosecutors turn over proffer notes and prior statements, so that defense lawyers could test whether a witness's story had shifted over time. In this sense, each case involving an insider like Salvatore not only advanced immediate goals, convicting certain defendants, weakening a specific family, but also fed into a continuing process of refining how the state used such testimony. From the vantage point of history, his life also illuminates the limits of law enforcement's reach. The demise of one structure of organized crime did not mean the elimination of criminal opportunity. As the classic mafia rackets, street-level bookmaking, direct protection payments, certain forms of labor racketeering, became more difficult to sustain under sustained federal scrutiny, other forms of illicit activity expanded. Fraud schemes exploiting new financial instruments, drug networks spanning continents, cyber-enabled theft and extortion. These phenomena presented different investigative challenges. The techniques honed in debriefing mid-level mafia captains could not simply be copy-pasted onto these newer threats. They had to be translated, adjusted, sometimes abandoned in favor of completely different approaches. Nevertheless, the essential insight that emerged from cases like Salvatore's retained its force. When confronting any resilient, secretive criminal organization, one of the most effective strategies is to convince people inside it that their long-term interests no longer align with the group's survival. In the mafia's case, that misalignment was sharpened by RICO sentences that could keep men in prison for decades, and by internal wars that made loyalties feel less secure. In other contexts, different pressure points might be more salient. ideological disillusionment in extremist groups, for example, or financial disputes in certain fraud rings. But the basic logic of offering credible alternatives to silence remained. For those who study Italian-American history, Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta's trajectory is a reminder of how thoroughly the image of the mafia came to dominate public perceptions of that community in the mid-20th century, and how much effort has gone into decoupling that association since. Families whose ancestors had labored as longshoremen, garment workers, and small shopkeepers watched, not always happily, as cultural production fixated instead on the relatively small subset who joined organized crime families. The eventual unraveling of those criminal networks, aided by insiders like him, created room for new narratives of professional success, of political engagement, of cultural contributions that had nothing to do with violence or corruption. In that sense, his cooperation can be seen as contributing, however indirectly, to a broader process of redefinition. By exposing the mechanics of the Colombo family's activities, he helped strip away some of the mystique that had attached to mafia figures. The dry language of his testimony, talk of collections, meetings, and our people insert unions, made plain that the organization functioned less like a romantic brotherhood and more like a predatory business, extracting value from its own communities. When younger Italian Americans read about those cases, many felt only distance from the world he described. Their ambitions lay elsewhere, in spheres where their surnames carried no implied entanglement with that vanished underworld. There is, too, a quieter legacy. Impossible to quantify but nonetheless real. The changed climate of fear in places where a captain like Fat Sal once held sway. Business owners who no longer set aside weekly cash for unreceipted payments. Workers whose promotions were no longer contingent on pleasing a shadowy fixer. Residents who no longer instinctively lowered their voices when certain names were mentioned. All inhabit a social environment partly shaped by the investigations that his cooperation advanced. That does not mean their lives are free from hardship or injustice, only that one particular layer of informal, coercive control has been thinned. As for Salvatore himself, the final chapters of his life remain largely out of public reach, by design. If he followed the pattern of many long-term cooperators, he would have served his reduced sentence in conditions that kept him separate from former associates, then been transferred quietly into a new community. There, he would have had to construct routines unconnected to the old rhythms of the mafia calendar. No more feast day processions used as discrete meeting points. No more late-night sessions in club back rooms. No more unspoken expectations about which weddings or funerals a captain must attend. Simple acts, shopping for groceries, starting a new job, introducing himself to neighbors under an assumed name, would have replaced the rituals of his former status. Whether he ever sought to make sense of his past in a more reflective way is unknown. Unlike some cooperators who have published memoirs or agreed to tell all interviews, he has left no public record of introspection. In that silence, observers are left to draw their own conclusions based on the documented facts. He spent years helping run criminal enterprises that harmed his own community. He then devoted years to helping the state dismantle part of that apparatus. He received, in exchange, a measure of leniency and protection that his victims never enjoyed. How to weigh those elements against one another is as much an ethical question as an historical one. What the historical record can state clearly is that his life tracks, with unusual precision, the arc of a particular era in American organized crime. He entered the mafia when it still drew heavily from tight Italian-American enclaves, operated largely through face-to-face relationships, and relied on a mix of intimidation and ingrained neighborhood deference. He reached his peak just as federal law enforcement, armed with new statutes and techniques, began seriously eroding the old order. And he turned cooperator at the moment when internal conflicts, like the Colombo War, made the cost of unqualified loyalty higher than it had ever been. In each phase, His individual decisions both reflected and contributed to the shifting balance between underworld power and state authority. The courtroom scene with which this story opened, Salvatore, Fat Sal Miciotta leaning toward a microphone in Brooklyn, explaining a world he had once served, captures that balance at its most charged. Around him sat representatives of all the constituencies his life had touched, agents and prosecutors who saw him as a crucial tool, former comrades who now considered him a traitor, relatives of men whose fates were intertwined with his, reporters attempting to distill the drama into concise dispatches, and ultimately, jurors tasked with deciding how much weight to give his words. That moment, repeated in different forms in multiple trials, stands as a symbolic hinge between two eras, one in which the mafia's internal affairs remained largely its own, and one in which those affairs became subject to public, legal scrutiny. As time passes, the raw emotions of those trials fade, and what remains are the records, transcripts, rulings, sentencing memoranda, news reports. In those documents, the figure of Fat Sal appears less as a vivid personality than as a node in various networks, of criminal association, of legal argument, of institutional learning. For historians and legal scholars, that is both a limitation and a gift. The lack of personal detail prevents us from turning his story into a tidy tale of sin and redemption. The abundance of factual material allows us instead to trace how his actions interacted with larger forces. In the end, the significance of Salvatore, Fat Sal, Micciotta's life lies not in any singular dramatic episode, but in the cumulative pattern it reveals. It shows how someone can be shaped by the constraints and opportunities of a specific social world, how they can rise within an organization that exploits those constraints, and how they can later help dismantle that same organization under the pressure of evolving legal and institutional realities. It reminds us that the history of organized crime is not only about bosses and coups, but about the countless men in the middle tiers whose choices, recorded in depositions and plea agreements, quietly altered the balance between secrecy and accountability. Somewhere under a name that does not appear in these records, the man once known as Fat Sal has aged beyond the years when his presence on a Brooklyn sidewalk would have drawn deference or fear. New generations walk those sidewalks without knowing who he was or what authority he once wielded there. Yet the absence of that authority, the fact that their worries and hopes are shaped by different forces, is part of his legacy, too. Through the long, uneasy path from captain to cooperating witness, from neighborhood figure to protected unknown, Salvatore, Fat Sal, Miciotta helped close one chapter in the story of American organized crime, leaving behind a record that continues to inform how we understand both the damage that world inflicted and the means by which it was, however imperfectly, brought to account.